It's your lucky day. A good friend of yours tells you they just won a trip to the land down under as part of a movie promotion, and they get to bring a +1. It isn't until you're on your way to the airport that your friend mentions that the free vacation comes with one small catch. Since the movie promotion was for an upcoming horror film, you'll both have to spend the night in Australia's most haunted house, the Monte Cristo Homestead. That's no problem. You don't even believe in ghosts. Once you arrive at the Monte Cristo Homestead, just after noon, you settle into your guest room. The giant 2-story mansion seems surprisingly quite peaceful. Surrounding the main mansion is a slew of other buildings. There's the original homestead, the dairy, and there's even a gift shop. You peek into the carriage house, admiring the collection of horse-drawn carriages from a simpler but more difficult time. It's empty, almost eerily quiet. But as you walk through the room, you see something moving behind one of the carriages. The ghost of a boy, burned to a crisp, reaching out a skeletal hand for you. You take a step back and wonder if you haven't just agreed to stay in a little patch of heaven, but instead, a bit of hell on earth. Welcome to Haunted Places. I'm Greg Polson. Every Thursday, I take you to the scariest, eeriest, most haunted, real places on Earth. This week, join me on a supernatural journey to the monstrous Monte Cristo Homestead and discover why, to this day, it's haunted. Listen to more episodes of Haunted Places, as well as Parcast's other podcasts, on your favorite podcast directory. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast, on Twitter at Parcast Network, and at parcast.com. Many of you have asked how you can support Haunted Places. If you enjoy the show, the best way to support us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. For a place named after Christ, it's anything but holy. The Monte Cristo Homestead in Junee, New South Wales, Australia, has seen more than its share of horrors over its 140 years of existence. Murder, suicide, mutilation, and torture have played out around nearly every acre of the homestead. The land was named Monte Cristo, or Mount of Christ, by the land's owner, Christopher William Crawley. After failing as a farmer, Mr. Crawley jumped into the hotel business right before the town of Junee opened a railway station. With Junee resting right in between the major cities along Australia's Great Southern Rail, Mr. Crawley's hotel became a popular place to retire for weary travelers. With a seemingly endless supply of renters always at the ready, Mr. Crawley's hotel quickly made him a very wealthy man. With a huge fortune at his disposal, Mr. Crawley was eager to show everyone in the small outback town that he was a man of great importance. So, in 1884, he began to build the iconic rectangular mansion that would soon become a haunted house of horrors. During the first few years at the Monte Cristo, life was comfortable for the Crawleys. But it wasn't long before paranormal activity would take up residence, and once it did, it would claim its first victim quite early. Some said it was an accident. Others claimed it was intentional. There were even a few that were certain it was a sacrifice for a rumored deal Mr. Crawley made with an advisor not of this world. It was 1888, and Beryl had just been hired as the nanny for the Crawleys' baby, Ethel. She was tender at 10 months old and cute as a button. Her cheeks were chubby, and her face was never without a smile. When Beryl saw her for the first time, she knew that they shared some sort of connection, and she would take great joy in caring for the baby. Those feelings eased Beryl's worry about accepting the job. Beryl knew the nanny that had the job before her, and she had told Beryl many unsettling stories about Ethel's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Crawley. They paid well, sure, but they were demanding, very particular, and firm believers in corporal punishment to correct staff missteps. Beryl had plenty of experience working for harsh bosses, so she felt up to the challenge. What really had Beryl unsettled about accepting the job was the house itself. Like everyone else in Junee, Beryl watched as the Monte Cristo was quickly erected on the hill. As soon as the first hole was dug for the foundation, stories started to swirl in town from the Aboriginal men on the construction crew that the land on which they were working should not have been used to build such a massive house. The Aboriginals said that the land was sacred, and disturbing it to the degree they were would only anger the balance of nature. Once nature was angered, its vengeance was powerful and everlasting. Being a descendant of the colonizers, Beryl typically didn't believe the tall tales of the native people. But the first time she stepped foot onto the Monte Cristo homestead, she felt as if something was always dragging her down. It was enough for her to wonder if this time the Aboriginal story of unbalanced nature had some weight. On Beryl's first day of caring for little Ethel, all her worries about her bosses and the land on which she worked were whisked away. Caring for Ethel was like spending time with an angel. But on Beryl's second day of work, Beryl's happiness began to wither when she started to feel an invisible presence around her all the time. At first, it felt like the presence was always watching Beryl. It didn't matter where she went in the house. She felt a pair of eyes burning a hole in her from practically every angle. Finally, after having enough of the constant surveillance, Beryl lashed out at the presence. In a fit of rage, she yelled into the air and commanded the presence to leave her alone. But the tongue lashing didn't have the effect Beryl desired. It only made things worse. The next morning, the presence went from observer to attacker. From the moment she walked into Ethel's room at the crack of dawn, Beryl felt like there was someone bumping her. Sometimes the force was so great it knocked objects out of her hands. After weeks of constant pokes, prods, and pushes by the presence, Beryl hatched a desperate plan to rid herself of the presence for good. While accompanying the Crawleys to a midweek church service, Beryl borrowed a crucifix and a bit of holy water from the chapel. Back at the house, after Ethel was fast asleep, Beryl held the cross in one hand and flicked the holy water all around her. She repeated a prayer over and over, then demanded in the name of her Lord that whatever spirit had it in for her vanquish itself from her forever. For a handful of days after that, the assaults relented. But it was only because the spirit was building up energy to launch a deadly counterattack. On a busy Sunday morning, hours before the family's weekly church service, Beryl left Ethel's second-floor nursery with Ethel in her arms, and she began to feel the peering presence all around her once again. In a rush to get Ethel to her parents, who were already in the carriage, Beryl tried to ignore the presence as she walked down the hallway toward the staircase. As they went, Ethel began to get unusually fussy. When the pair reached the stairs, Beryl stopped as she tried to adjust a ribbon on Ethel's dress that had become undone. Just then, as Beryl finished tying the knot, Ethel was suddenly lifted out of her arms and into the air. Ethel's tiny body floated up with such force that even the ribbon in between Beryl's fingertips was plucked away from her grip. Beryl's heart stopped as she watched in horror at the baby floating above her head. Beryl wanted to reach out and grab Ethel, but her body was frozen in all-encompassing fear. She could do nothing but watch with horror as Ethel dropped from midair and onto the stairs. As Ethel rolled down the stairs, her tiny limbs twisted and turned like a corkscrew was controlling them. When Ethel's body finally came to a stop on the first floor, Beryl emitted a soul-shattering scream. The sound was so loud that even the horses outside got spooked. Soon the entire household rushed to the staircase, and when the crowd gathered, they found Beryl with a motionless Ethel in her arms, repeating to everyone that the presence did it. Ethel Crawley, aged 10 months, is buried at the Junee Cemetery. You can visit her headstone if you so wish. The nanny who oversaw her death was sent away to an institution after the incident. It's been widely reported that the nanny swore until the day she died that Ethel's death was caused by an otherworldly entity which lived in the house. If you ever find yourself in the Monte Cristo mansion, maybe you'll experience what nearly hundreds of tourists, visitors, and residents have: a shove, pulls, or grab by an entity that can't be seen by the naked eye. If you do experience such an invasion of your personal space, a fair bit of warning. It'd probably be best not to talk back. Now for a favorite of ours here at Parcast. It's not a Parcast podcast, but if you like haunted places, I think you might like The Horror of Dolores Roach, a new horror fiction podcast I found. The Horror of Dolores Roach tells a macabre urban legend of murder, betrayal, weed, gentrification, cannibalism, and survival of the fittest. When Dolores Roach returns to her old New York City neighborhood after 16 years in prison, she's stunned by all that's changed. The only person remaining from her previous life is Luis, an old stoner friend who gives her room and board in the basement underneath his dilapidated empanada shop. When the promise of her newfound stability is quickly threatened, Magic Hands Dolores is driven to extremes to survive. The Horror of Dolores Roach stars Daphne Rubin Vega and Bobby Cannavale and is written by Aaron Mark. I think it's a great podcast, but don't take my word for it. Refinery 29 says, The Horror of Dolores Roach stands out from the rest. It's totally fictional, but still equally chilling. You can listen to all episodes of The Horror of Dolores Roach now for free, wherever you get your podcasts. I have some exciting news for you. Starting now, you can listen to Haunted Places episodes that are older than 6 months, completely ad-free, exclusively on Stitcher Premium. We're always looking for ways to improve the listener experience. We found an amazing partner in Stitcher to bring you episodes ad-free 6 months after they're released. Again, this will only affect episodes that are older than 6 months. Nothing else will change. We'll still be releasing new Haunted Places episodes wherever you listen to podcasts. For a free month trial, go to stitcherpremium.com/Parcast and use promo code Parcast. That's stitcherpremium.com/Parcast and use promo code Parcast. Now, let's get back to the story. The year was 1905. And teenager Inala was being forced to work as a maid at the Monte Cristo Homestead. Inala was Aboriginal, and when she was told to do something by the colonizers, she had to do it. That sort of subservience eventually led to late-night calls to the private quarters of Mr. Crawley. Those visits gave birth to a growing problem for Inala. She was pregnant, and if she revealed who the father was, she'd be facing huge problems. Being a girl in her situation came with a lot of anxiety. Those anxieties were starting to become overwhelming. She started to have visions of having her newborn ripped away from her. It didn't matter where she went around the estate. The dairy, the stable, the grand ballroom, even in the servants' living quarters, she could never escape the visceral visions of a horrible future. To make matters worse, every time she got near the mansion's stairwell, she felt as if a disembodied force was attempting to physically pull her baby out of her womb. The pulls and tugs made Inala writhe in pain, and the decline of productivity would earn the teen a lashing from the iron rod of Mrs. Crawley. But the physical pain Inala suffered was nothing compared to the visions. Both while awake and asleep, her visions of uniformed men ripping away her newborn became more and more realistic. Given Inala's heritage, she often wondered if the intensity of her oracle-like ability came from the earth beneath her. In the slivers of time Inala had clarity of mind, she hatched a plan to escape the fate that was on its way to meet her. There was only one way to keep her and her child together forever. That night, Inala climbed atop the green wrought iron fence around the Monte Cristo mansion's second-story balcony. She balanced herself and outstretched her arms as if she was being crucified. She closed her eyes. A soft gust of wind caressed her face, and she tipped herself over the edge of the fence toward the ground. She was dead upon impact. Blood seeped out around Inala's broken body on the concrete steps before the mansion's front doors. Now, no one will ever be able to separate her baby from her. The children ripped away from their Aboriginal mothers during the early 20th century are known today as Australia's stolen generations. It's a permanent stain on the country's history, like the bloodstain that remains to this day on the front steps of the Monte Cristo from the pregnant maid that jumped to her death. Maybe the location of her desperate action was intentional, as nearly everyone who crosses the front steps today reports a feeling of great sadness overtaking them. The dark sadness could also be the reason why many overnight guests claim not being able to get a restful night's sleep. Many bed and breakfasters have recounted experiences of terrifyingly realistic nightmares of a very personal nature. So if you ever brave an overnight stay in the mansion, be sure to pack a sleep aid and think happy thoughts. It's mid-afternoon in Junee. Oliver, age 12, and his group of friends have just wrapped up a game of cricket. Oliver's side lost, and he's anxious to reclaim some pride. The winning team tells him if he goes up to the abandoned Monte Cristo homestead and enters the dairy, they'd all hail him as the bravest boy in town. Ever since the last remaining Crawley family members moved out of the mansion a few years ago, in 1948, rumors have swirled about a monster living inside the brick building behind the mansion. Many people around Junee have said that if you get close enough to the homestead, you can hear someone or something wailing, roaring, or howling from the inside of the small brick building. Anxious to prove his manhood, Oliver accepts the challenge and begins to ride his bike toward the homestead. The other boys follow, but at a distance. When Oliver reaches the Monte Cristo homestead, the sun is hanging low over the horizon. He marches up to the hill as his friends watch from the edge of the property. As Oliver gets to the mansion, he doesn't hear anything. He breathes a sigh of relief. He eyes the dairy. It's a small brick building that resembles a very tiny cottage. Oliver continues to march toward it and stops when he reaches his destination. He leans in an ear toward the building with the expectation of hearing the monster. But there's still no sound coming from inside. Oliver tries to gander in the small square window, but a thick layer of dust blocks his view. He cautiously approaches the rotting wooden door and twists the handle. He stops, turns around, and sees some of his friends watching him from near the mansion. After all, someone must verify the deed has been accomplished. There's no way to back out now. Oliver pushes the door open. A bit of waning sunlight that's still left illuminates the interior of the building, and Oliver comes face to face with a sight that's truly monstrous. Chained to the wall is a gaunt man, about 30 years old. He has sunken eyes, tattered clothes, and scraggly, thinning hair. He's not alone. In his scrawny arms, he clutches the dried up and nearly mummified body of an old woman. The man rocks back and forth, back and forth. Oliver's throat goes dry just as quick as his pants get wet from the urine that seeps down his leg and onto the ground. The man raises his head, locks eyes with Oliver, and mutters one word. Mummy, 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 mummy. Today, a sign hangs outside of the cottage that details the story of the man who was chained to the wall. His name was Harold Steele, and he was the mentally disabled son of the woman he was discovered clutching. His mother, Mrs. Steele, was a servant at the Monte Cristo Homestead. And when the last of the Crawley family moved out of the property, she and her son were allowed to live in the dairy, rent-free. It's said they were allowed to live there because it was widely rumored, but never proven, that Harold was the illegitimate son of Mr. Crawley. When Harold was a boy, he suffered a head injury from a carriage accident. The injury left him prone to violent outbursts. Not knowing what to do with a boy with special needs, the Crawleys had him chained to the wall in the dairy to keep him under control. After the police found Harold, with his dead mother in his arms, he was sent to an asylum where he died soon after arrival. Inside the dairy, to this day, there's a hole in the wall where the chain was once connected to the permanently imprisoned man. A few people have stated that if you're quiet, you can hear the soft sound of a chain being dragged along the ground. If you do hear the sound, you'll probably want to get away quickly, lest you come face to face with the spirit of poor old Harold, who may want to embrace you in his loving arms. Here's something we hope you'll enjoy.
As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on two large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood.
Parcast's new mythology podcast dramatizes ancient myths for a modern audience and dives into their history, origins, and meaning. Hosted by my friend Vanessa Richardson, Mythology uses an ensemble cast to bring these stories to life. Every episode dramatizes an exciting story pulled from the beliefs of ancient cultures and gives insight into how our ancestors saw the universe. Stick around after this episode to hear a preview of Mythology's Part 1 on the Greek goddess Athena. New episodes come out every Tuesday. Search for and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts.
Now, back to the story. Jackie Simpson took the job of caretaker of the abandoned Monte Cristo Homestead in 1961. He knew the horrific story of the property, but work was hard to get, and he readily took the job of watching over the massive estate. The gig was easy. It mostly involved trimming away the overgrowth, keeping the wild animals from taking up residence, and making sure no local thrill-seekers made their way inside any of the buildings. Jackie was just one of many in a line of caretakers, since the last living soul, Harold Steele, moved away from the property. It was decided that the dairy, where Harold Steele lived with his mother, would be converted into the caretaker's cottage. Sure, Jackie heard the occasional movement of a chain, but otherwise found staying in the cottage quite peaceful. Being in solitude gave him a lot of time to catch up on some reading. One afternoon, while he was lost in a spine-tingling thriller, a teenager pulled up in his car at the bottom of the hill near the edge of the homestead. He was a nice-looking boy with a clean, pressed polo shirt and neatly combed hair. Everything about him was normal, except the deranged look in his eyes. His gaze was locked on the dilapidated Monte Cristo mansion. He reached into the back seat to grab a long metal object. From his slow, deliberate movements, it was clear he was a young man on a mission. He almost seemed possessed. Slowly, the teen got out of the car and began talking to himself. It started out like a mundane conversation at first, but then it morphed into an argument with some silent, invisible companion. He only used a few words. Yes. No. I know. And I will. As he got closer to the homestead, the teen became more manic, and his one-way conversation intensified in volume. With each step he took, he became more and more crazed. Back at the cottage, Jackie was lying in bed, still engrossed in his book. He heard someone approaching outside. With a bit of annoyance at the unplanned caller, he got out of bed, slid his slippers on, and shuffled to the door. When he opened the door, he was met with the barrel of a rifle. It was the teenager. Except now his shirt was unbuttoned and his hair was frazzled. Before Jackie could utter even a word, the teen pulled the trigger, and Jackie's brains splattered against the wall. The young killer set the rifle on the ground and pulled out a small utility knife from his front pocket. With a manic smile on his face, he began to etch something into the wooden door. Once his handiwork was complete, the teenager took a step back to admire his message and laughed, while buckets worth of Jackie's blood pooled around his feet. If you know where to look, you can see for yourself what the teen wrote into the door. It's faint, but it's still there. All it reads in the dry, dead wood is, "Die, Jack. Ha ha." The authorities were never able to decipher a motive for the cold-blooded crime. By all accounts, the killer didn't even know Jackie. All the investigators could come up with was that the murderer watched the Hitchcock film Psycho multiple times at the local movie theater before he carried out the crime. With no explanation for the crime, people in town just said that the Monte Cristo Homestead somehow made the teen insane. Another prevailing theory was that the killer became possessed by an evil, otherworldly entity that was theorized to have resided at the estate. With all the horrible things that had happened at the homestead over the years, either explanation seemed to be sufficient to satisfy even the most curious of minds. Many visitors to the homestead, before and after the murder of Jackie Simpson, often claim that their minds become foggy and filled with violent thoughts. So if you ever take a stroll up the hill to the Monte Cristo Homestead and find yourself dwelling on doing devilish deeds, just breathe and keep reminding yourself that you are a good person. So good, in fact, that you wouldn't harm even a fly. Bindi is not your average 9-year-old girl. She doesn't get along with others because the other kids make fun of her for talking to herself. At least that's what they think she's doing. In reality, she's talking to the dead people she sees all around her. Sometimes Bindi asks them to leave her alone when they're scary, and other times, when they're kids like her, she asks them if she can help them. When you're a child with gifts like Bindi, you can be quite a handful for your parents. Her mother is never sure when Bindi might see people out of place, as her daughter calls them, so she made it a priority to keep her daughter close to her at all times. Today, on this cool winter day in July of 1980, Bindi accompanies her mom to the Monte Cristo Homestead. Her mom is the top wallpaper salesperson in all of New South Wales, and the current owners of the estate, who are painstakingly trying to restore the weathered mansion to its former glory, are looking to make some improvements to the interior. While Bindi's mom and the home's owner head to the kitchen, Bindi begins to wander. She's fascinated with the odd antiques that surround her. Soon, Bindi finds herself at the base of a staircase that leads up to the second level. An ever-curious child, Bindi cautiously places her cartoon character shoe on the first step. She continues to climb, but with every step, she feels her chest tightening. By the time she's 4 steps up, she begins to gasp for air. She grabs her neck and struggles to fill her lungs. As she does, she looks to the top of the stairs and sees a specter manifest before her. The ghost is dressed in all black from head to toe and holds an iron rod in her hands. Mrs. Crawley. A wry smile forms on Mrs. Crawley's face, and the pressure in Bindi's chest suddenly releases. Now that she can breathe, she emits an ear-piercing shriek. The fear rushing through her small body is so powerful that it causes her to black out. When Bindi awakes, she's at the bottom of the staircase, her mother looking down at her with tears in her eyes. In 1963, the Monte Cristo Homestead was purchased by new owners that still own it today. Since then, they've stated many times in print and elsewhere that the mansion's staircase causes a great deal of distress for many children. No one is quite sure why, but the current Monte Cristo Homestead owners say that any time children begin to climb up the stairs to the second level, they're struck with fits of anger or paralyzing fear. It's even been noted that on occasion, some kids will suffer from sudden asthma attacks. One thing that is known is that the ghost of Mrs. Crawley tends to stay exclusively on the upper level of the mansion, where she spent a great majority of her time until her death in 1933. Given the horrid history of the homestead, it's probably not the best place to bring along a child. But if you do, keep them close by your side, especially if you decide to explore the upper level. Shaz is an avid ghost hunter. While she hasn't had much luck capturing any solid evidence of the supernatural yet, she hopes that by venturing out of Melbourne and to Australia's most haunted house in Junee, maybe now is her time. So far, 2018 has been pretty good to her. She's managed to gain a whole lot of new followers on social media, from people that want to live vicariously through her paranormal explorations. With her hopes high and her best ghost hunting equipment packed, she makes the drive deep into the state of New South Wales to the Monte Cristo Homestead. She arrives at the mansion and checks into her first floor guest room. When the sun sets and darkness falls, Shaz takes the guided group tour and learns every twisted tale the house has to offer. When the tour is complete, Shaz begins to explore the homestead on her own, with the hopes of capturing one or many EVPs. Excited, she decides to start her search in the carriage house. As she opens the door and enters, she feels a tug on the back of her shirt. A chill runs down her spine. Shaz cautiously turns around and discovers that a bit of thread from her shirt is caught on a jagged piece of wood. She breathes a sigh of relief and unhooks herself. Shaz begins to walk around the inside of the building and digs out a small voice recorder from her pocket. Once she turns it on, she tries to think back to the story she heard on the tour. Before it was a carriage house, the building was a horse stable for Mrs. Crawley's prized steeds. One of the workers who cared for the horses was a young boy named Morris. Morris slept in the stable. One day, after being too ill to get out of bed, Mr. Crawley lit his bed on fire, hoping it would motivate him to get out of bed. It didn't. Instead, it burned him alive. Shaz hits record on her device and begins to ask questions to the air. After cycling through every question she can think of, she hits stop. With a smile on her face, she presses the playback button. She hears herself asking if anyone's there, and she's shocked. When as clear as day, she hears the labored voice of a young boy reply, "Help me." She felt something tugging at her shirt again. Very cautiously, she turned around and saw a little boy. Skin charred completely black. Eyes melted out of their sockets. He was reaching out for her. Shaz turned and sprinted out of the carriage house, all the way back to her car. The fun was over for her. She never went on a ghost hunt again. Hundreds of professional and aspiring ghost hunters have descended upon the Monte Cristo Homestead in search of paranormal activity. The ones hoping for EVPs have been surprised and sometimes terrified to find them. Some recorded voices beg for assistance, while others demand immediate exit. But there are a few voices that have more cryptic messages from beyond the grave. Search for yourself and see if you can decipher what messages the spirits of the Monte Cristo Homestead have in store for you. Thanks for listening to Haunted Places. A new episode comes out every Thursday. Listen to all of Parcast's podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, CastBox, TuneIn, or your favorite podcast directory. Many of you have asked how to help the show. And if you enjoy Haunted Places, the best way to help is to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. We'll see you next week. Haunted Places was created by Max Cutler. It's a production of Cutler Media and is part of the Parcast Network. It's produced by Max and Ron Cutler. Sound design by Ron Shapiro. With production assistance by Paul Mahler, Maggie Admire, and Carly Madden. Haunted Places is written by Sammy Sarzosa. I'm Greg Polson.
And now, please enjoy this preview of Mythology's first episode on the Greek goddess Athena.
It was foolish to challenge the gods. After battling the goddess Athena for 3 days, Enceladus had all but resigned himself to the fate of so many of his fellow giants. But he'd escaped her for the moment, and perhaps that would become his advantage. Enceladus had barely caught his breath when he heard the horses. He whipped around, worried Athena had tracked him to the Ionian Sea, but it was one of Enceladus' own, another giant. As the giant grew closer, Enceladus realized something was wrong. Instead of legs, Enceladus and his brother giants slithered on 2 large serpents with snapping maws where the feet should be. But this giant's serpents weren't snapping, and its face sagged. An arrow whizzed past Enceladus' face. This wasn't a giant. It was a god.
You foolish, foolish giant. No one rebels against the gods and escapes unscathed.
Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, peeled off the face of a giant she'd flayed alive, revealing her own face, dripping with blood. She kept the skin wrapped around her like a cloak. Enceladus's leg serpents snapped and spit at Athena, but their fangs couldn't pierce the hide of his own kind. It was a perfect shield. Athena knocked Enceladus into the Ionian Sea. Then she crouched down and lifted the entire isle of Sikolos. Athena had a divine, godly strength. Plucking an island out of the ocean was as easy for her as it was for a man to pick up his child. Athena straightened up, raising the island above her. She swung it around over Enceladus and slammed the island on his head. Enceladus crumpled under the blow of the island. He sank and then vanished beneath the landmass. His blood and anger rippled outward from the island. The place where Enceladus was defeated became Mount Etna, and the buried giant was reduced to expressing his wrath through eruptions and earthquakes. Yet something wasn't right. As she watched steam build above Mount Etna, Athena knew her heart was missing a piece. She'd used her wisdom and wit to defeat the enemy, embracing her role as a goddess of war, and it felt empty. She was destined for something greater. She was certain. Welcome to Mythology on the Parcast Network. Every Tuesday, we present dramatic stories from ancient mythology and explore their origins. I'm your host and narrator, Vanessa Richardson. Today, we're focusing on the Greek goddess Athena. She's the goddess of war and military strategy, but also the goddess of wisdom, civilization, and the arts. In her mythology, she's caught between who she is and who she wants to be. New episodes of Mythology release every Tuesday, and you can find us and all of Parcast's podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts. At Parcast, we are grateful for you, our listeners. You allow us to do what we love. Let us know how we're doing. Reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and Twitter at Parcast Network. And if you enjoyed today's episode, the best way to help us is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. It really does help us. We also now have merchandise. Head to parcast.com/merch for more information. Something to note in these episodes, all Greek myths have many versions and variations. We've selected those we felt are the most dramatic and entertaining, and supplemented them with additional research into Greek traditions. Additionally, each Greek myth takes place in a wide expanded universe. While we'll cover some major myths of Athena over the next few episodes, this won't be her only appearance in the podcast. Goddess of the arts and of war, Athena exhibits a dichotomy in Greek culture. She's a woman warrior in a culture where women didn't go to war, and a household goddess who vowed to never be a lover or a mother. Athena is masculine, feminine, and something greater than both. She's a goddess for everyone, and a goddess for no one. Ancient Greek society had clear gender roles, treating women as second-class citizens. But Athena exists outside that construct. She'll skin a giant alive and then go weave a tapestry. She's as apt to teach men gardening and pottery as she is to help them slay their enemies. Unlike her half-brother and rival, Ares, the war god, Athena approaches war with logic and meditation. At the start of a battle, Ares leaps into action, while Athena waits, plans, then leads men to bloody victory. She values rational thinking over emotion, but is not without rage and bloodlust. Classicist Walter F. Otto characterized Athena as the goddess of nearness because she was always beside the Greek heroes in battle, guiding their spears and swords. She is, like all Greek gods, a killer. However, Athena prefers to change errant humans into other forms, doling out punishments while preserving life. She also transforms herself, taking a male appearance multiple times in the Iliad and the Odyssey. That isn't to say she doesn't embrace a female role too. In today's myths, the building of the Palladium, the judgment of Paris, and the story of Arachne, Athena strives to be recognized as feminine, and this may be the hardest battle the goddess of war has ever fought. The king of the gods had a headache, and Zeus's son Hephaestus, like many children, was only making it worse. Hephaestus was god of the forge, born with a clubfoot. To him, a headache was nothing.
And then I realized I could put another axe head on my existing axe and kill 2 men with 1 blow. Genius, right?
Oh, my head is killing me.
That's the idea. Both heads could kill. 2 heads, 1 axe.
Zeus gestured to his forehead, frustrated.
It feels like my skull is expanding and contracting. Maybe I should go...
Oh, headache. I thought we were still on axe heads.
Zeus continued moaning as he dropped to the floor, gripped his head, and rocked back and forth. Hephaestus looked on, torn between sympathy and opportunity.
Anything I can do? Maybe take over your duties for a time? Not that a headache could ever take down the great god Zeus.
Oh, Hephaestus, will you... Oh.
Hephaestus eyed his brand new double-headed axe. Then Zeus doubled over in front of him. The opportunity was ripe. Zeus had overthrown Hephaestus' grandfather. Perhaps patricide ran in the family.
Oh, make it stop. End it. I'll cut off my head.
Hephaestus hid his grin as he grabbed his double-head axe. After today, the gods of Mount Olympus would bow to Hephaestus. He wound up and aimed straight for Zeus's skull. The axe cleaved Zeus's head in half. As Zeus's eyes spread wide apart, a battle helmet emerged from where his brain should have been. Hephaestus dropped his axe in shock as a fully armored warrior woman sprang from Zeus's head, shouting a battle cry. All thoughts of ruling Mount Olympus faded in the face of this fearsome, beautiful goddess. Ready for battle, Athena stepped out of her father's head and into the light of Mount Olympus. Athena was born without a mother, the child of Zeus alone. She emerged a rational adult, capable of complex thought and ready to fight for her life. Yet because the Greek gods are modeled on humans, with human flaws and emotions, there is one story of Athena's childhood and a youthful accident that guided the rest of her life. Zeus was accustomed to his children having a mother, so after he fused his head back together, he wasn't sure what to do with Athena. Eventually, the single dad sent his new daughter away to be educated by his nephew, Triton. Triton was a fish-tailed ocean god, so Athena spent much of her time in and around water, and more of her time with Triton's daughter, Pallas. Pallas was a water nymph, a maiden of the ocean, and Athena's only friend. But today, the war goddess and the water nymph raised their swords, squaring off against each other. The pair sparred on the surface of a lake. Pallas floated amid a column of waves, her long hair and shimmering fishtail distracting from her killer aim. Athena defended herself from atop a sleek raft, wearing armor as always. She pushed her sword forward, calling out her moves as she executed them.
Striking, stabbing,
Dodging.
ducking, and slicing.
Lunging.
As Pallas lunged, Athena used her shield to knock Pallas over. Rising from the waves, Pallas spit water into Athena's face.
Hey!
Pallas spouted more water, somehow forming it into perfect concentric circles, like aquatic smoke rings. Athena couldn't help but laugh.
Pallas, be serious. My father's coming to watch us spar tomorrow. We have to impress him.
You have to impress him. If I impress him, you know where I'll end up. And my father won't be happy about that.
You're filthy.
You've heard the stories, and you have 100 half-siblings to prove it.
37. I have 37 half-siblings.
That's an army, warrior goddess.
Let's go again. I want to get that spinning parry right.
Athena was quite skilled in combat. It helped that she took to it naturally, like Pallas to water. She'd been ecstatic to hear Triton declare that they were finally good enough to spar in front of Zeus. The proud fathers had invited a crowd of gods, nymphs, and even a few mortals they fancied. Rowing out onto the lake, Athena fiddled with her helmet. She knew her armor made her look ferocious, but she still felt like a child in a woman's body. What if she fell off her raft? What if her mind went blank and she froze? What if her father, the king of the gods, thought she was only average? A terrifying column of water arose from the depths. Inside it, Pallas. She met Athena's eye and flashed a quick smile. Athena relaxed. She wasn't alone. She had Pallas. With her best friend beside her, Athena had nothing to worry about. They began to spar. In the audience, Zeus watched intently. Next to him, his wife Hera, the goddess of marriage, looked around, intent in a different way.
Aphrodite has such a nice nose, don't you think?
Sure. That's it. Slice and dodge. Well done.
You've never noticed it?
I guess it's fine, if you like noses.
It looks quite like Athena's.
Don't start on this again.
I don't understand why you...
She's going to fall in the water.
A wave crashed over Athena, soaking her. Athena slipped, but kept her footing on the raft.
Come on, Athena. You can do it. Get back up there. Raise that sword. You'll win this yet.
They aren't actually fighting. It's a mock spar.
At the end of which, my daughter will win.
Zeus nervously watched Athena struggle through the next few maneuvers.
She's going to fall and embarrass us.
Us? She does have a mother. I knew it.
I meant Athena and myself.
As Zeus worried, Athena relaxed into the rhythm of the spar. She breathed deeply as she pressed her shield against Pallas's sword. Her instincts took over. Suddenly, a new heat rushed through Athena's veins. She'd never felt this warrior power before, but it possessed her. Her feet danced more nimbly. Her sword twisted more sharply. She tasted metal in her mouth. For the first time, she might want to kill. Across the lake, Zeus adjusted his shield. The sun gleamed off of it. Getting an idea, he tilted his shield, aiming the ray of light at Pallas. In the water, the light caught Pallas's eye. She looked up. Meanwhile, Athena stabbed toward Pallas's heart, a final flourish. The perfectly executed move she was born for. This was her gift: combat. Athena lunged, expecting Pallas to dodge as they had rehearsed. She didn't notice that Pallas's face was tilted up, distracted. Pallas looked toward Zeus as Athena's sword pierced her heart. Instead of blood, water flowed from Pallas's wound. She shrank, dissolving, until all that was left were her eyes, which transformed into two wiggling minnows. Pallas was dead. If you enjoyed listening to this preview of our episode on Athena and want to hear the rest of it, search and subscribe to Mythology wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes release every Tuesday.